Welcome back, everybody, or anybody. This is a humorous history podcast. We're the goofy historians. We're going to talk today about Francis the First,
We're
king
not
of.
necessarily the goofyists,
We're
but
pretty
we're goof.
goofy, but there's probably other people that may be more goofy. You think? I don't know.
Probably sure if you look.
If you
But
look, you have to look, search for goofy historians on YouTube and see. But anyway, Francis the First was the king of France, and I'm really excited to be talking about Francis the First because the last podcast was Henry the Eighth, and it just physically wore me out. We talked for 50 minutes on that guy, and because there was a lot to talk about, but he wasn't a likable character, and so Francis the First is the complete opposite of that. A couple of disclaimers that we need to say up front: we're not real historians. We try to be funny, but we're not comedians. And what we're hoping is this is going to be mostly true and somewhat funny. So Francis the First, King of France, he was born in 1494 and he died in 1547 at the age of 52. He was similar in a lot of ways with Charles V that we talked about, as well as Henry the Eighth. They were all born around that same time period. They came into, the their reign because somebody else had died and stuff like that. But real quick, Francis the First, you could think of him as the French Renaissance king. Hung out with Leonardo da Vinci and was a humanist, brought Protestantism into France, I guess you could say, and started the French colonial expeditions in Canada, the Hudson Bay and all that area. He inherited the conflicts in Italy, the Italian wars, and he continued those. A lot of crazy things happened in those Italian wars. He actually aligned himself with the enemy, Suleiman the Magnificent, the leader of the Ottoman Turks. One of the most dramatic things with Francis I was in the Battle of Pavia during the Italian wars, and he was actually captured. And if it wasn't for this guy, Pedro de Valdivia, who later was the conqueror of Chile, that saved his butt, he would have been killed in that battle. After that, he spent a year in prison. But some of the color that we want to talk about, I think, is that Francis I was just a brilliant guy. But a couple of things: he was not a great father. He traded his two sons for his own freedom. And he's not a great husband. He mostly ignored his wives. Didn't kill any of them. Mostly just ignored them.
And you only had two.
He only had the two. And I think the most coolest thing
like,
is that
he just can't compete. And Carlos Quinto, Charles V, only had one, for God's sake. So
yeah, Henry VIII was
he had the mistresses.
Odd man out on that. But let's talk about how he loved to be king. You know, he loved sports. He loved war. He loved arts. He loved women. He loved his mom. Not like that. I mean, he really, they were close. And he traveled with an entourage of beautiful and clever women. They weren't just all concubines. They were people that were intelligent and educated and, but the other thing is that sets him apart, just a head and shoulders way above Henry VIII and above Charles V too, is that when he fought in battles, he wasn't just there to command he was in the freaking battles. And you could tell why, right? Because we talked about this a little bit. If Henry VIII was 6'2" and Francis I towered over Henry VIII, he was a huge guy and athletic. So you could imagine him in a suit of armor on the battlefield with his giant horse and just totally trained. He was probably if you're the owner of the football team, the manager of the football team, and the best player of the football team. That's what he was. He was like, wow, this guy was a character larger than life, right?
Yeah. And I mean, what they used to say is that he was famous for having a very big member, and he said, "That's my nose." It's my
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and he had a good sense of humor as well.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I think Carlos Quinto or Charles V was a freaking control freak, right? And a religious fanatic and plagued by guilt, right, through all his reign, right? Where Henry VIII is a total narcissist, right? An egotist, trying to, create a whole new religion because it's convenient, right? I think Francis the First was just someone who really enjoyed being king, right? He wasn't, he didn't like Charles V. That was his nemesis, right? And he had, because Charles V was, trying to serve, and there was a competition between Charles and Francis to become the Holy Roman Emperor, right? And that's
Henry
when
the Eighth
Clement
was in
first
there too, and he threw his lot in
yeah,
there.
English or what's his Henry VIII. They're all trying to become the Holy Roman Emperor, and Pope Clement VII was backing Francis until he realizes Carlos was going to buy it because he just sold himself to the Portuguese for like $1 billion, and so he could buy it. And so Clement V goes, sorry, Francis, I'm going with Carlos."
Nine
Um,
hundred
so
thousand ducats is what Charles V paid, and you know what? And so that's like $2 million. Uh, you know what? I don't think he got his money's worth out of that. I think he overpaid, and it didn't buy him anything. Anyway,
it
so
bought him a
Francis
lot of heartache.
brought him a lot of headaches and a lot of sleepless nights. But Francis the First didn't become the Holy Roman Emperor.
You just think of what happened if had become Holy Roman Emperor.
Probably
He
would have
was
been a way
much,
better situation.
he was a much more tolerant man, right? Maybe we would have had all the religious wars, or the 30-year war, or probably Clement VII would have never ended up in one of Charles's jail cells. So it would have been a better history going forward, and then Carlos could just maybe take care of the new world a little better instead of letting his conquistadors, do human rights abuses all over South America. Uh,
So Francis the First got into the colonial game, but he went north. Um, and the
yeah, that's
results are
because
still
the Pope, because
right.
after Charles V put him in jail, the Pope pretty much had him in his pocket, right? He had the Pope in his pocket, and that's when the Treaty of Tortosa, where they say we'll draw a line down South America. Well, first he gave the Pope gave Africa to the Spanish, like like the Pope had any right to do that. And then in the Treaty of Tortosa, they divided South America down the line, which divides Brazil from the rest of South America. And at that time, they found out that South America was a lot bigger than Columbus thought it was. And so Carlos is going, I can deal with this. I'll take everything to the west of Brazil, which was a lot of land, so it turned out to be a good deal.
But Charles V had no sway in North America above Florida, right? So all that
Yeah,
North American land was eventually, from the British and the French, and the French did good. They still own Quebec. Okay, we still speak French in French
well, they don't
Quebec.
own Quebec, but
Well, I'm
yeah,
talking about in terms of
culturally,
their historical significance as it has for
They still
today.
they still speak
But
a
anyway,
foreign.
so that was what it was. I don't think they were quite as brutal, but it's
No, it's funny. This is a funny story. I'll tell you a funny story because the French. So at that time, the English were coming into Jamestown and setting up, and the Puritans, they were getting their they were being farmers, right? And the French were always sent to Quebec, and then the French always ran away and lived with the Indians. And so, the King of France is going, why can't you be more like the English? Just stay on your friggin' farm. Stop running away to live with the English, right? And so, like, they sent LaSalle and these other missionary type people to try to, not so much to civilize the Indians at this point, it was to civilize the French, who had gone there first, because they were having all these religious things going on in France. So a lot of the French just escaped to go live as natives in
Here's
Canada.
actually where Netflix did a good job, I think. There's that show Frontier that talks about that. Not specifically only the French, but it talks about that area and the fur trade. The only things that really got massacred were the beavers.
Yeah, which is pretty tragic. But
Yeah,
that
well,
was
but you know what? There's
because,
still beavers today. It's not like the buffalo, you know. Well, actually, there's still
yeah,
buffalo too.
yeah,
You know
yeah.
what's interesting though? So if we can wind it back down a little bit to where he gets during the Italian Wars and he gets captured. So he stays as a prisoner in Madrid of Charles V for a year. While he is in prison and he's complaining like a cat that you stepped on his tail. He's just trying to get, no one wants to help him. He's even trying to get Suleiman to help him and all this.
His mother is trying to get his mother to help. He
But
writes to mom.
this was his thing. His mother kept. Okay, so think about this for a second. Charles V captures Francis. They're in a war. Why doesn't Charles V just go in and conquer France now? Because he cannot. Because Francis's mom is still controlling the freaking, and France is a huge, rich, powerful country. The Holy Roman Emperor can't just go take over France. Not going to happen because Mama is back on the throne waiting for her son. So yeah, that's what happened, right? I mean, his
Yeah,
mom.
and his wives too were very hands on. So
Yeah,
like Francis is actually born in Aquitaine, so he has that sort of Aquitaine
he's
blood in it
cool.
with
Yeah,
very
he's
very
like
powerful.
women are
His mother
fine.
was powerful, even though he didn't like his wives. They were very powerful, and his sister was powerful. Oh, like he loved powerful women, right? So
And clever
basically,
women. There was like
powerful,
one
clever,
lady.
intelligent women. So yeah, and poor Carlos couldn't go up against him.
No,
They would have. It's like take me prisoner. Just try it.
yeah, couldn't do it. So he finally did arrange. This is the crazy thing, and I'm gonna say something again that you think is silly, but it's interesting. So Francis gets out of prison by negotiating. He's going to give Charles V two of his sons, and these little guys are young. They're like, I don't know, like 10 or 12 years old. They
Yeah, when this was happening, Francis was like 23, right? So he's not a this. That's the other thing. Francis, Henry VIII, they're all in their early 20s when all this is going down, right? So all of Europe is being tried to be run by kids, right? 20-year-olds, right? And so they're like trying to figure this up and they're having fun doing it.
Well, anyway, so my point is that he gives Charles V two of his sons to release himself, and then as soon as he gets back to France, he reneges on everything because it was signed under duress. Think about that. He gave Charles his kids. Sorry, I'm yelling into the microphone. Shouldn't do that. But he gives Charles his sons and then reneges on the deal. Tell me, why wouldn't you, if you were Charles V, just kill those kids? You're gonna just like, try to do that? No.
Yeah, that's
You,
what I
you
mean. That's
gave
what
your
hostages
word, you
are.
gave your
Yeah.
kids, and then you reneged. Your kids should be, according to the laws of that time, executed. So Charles V, not a bad guy because he didn't. And you could say that that's a silly statement, but that was the point of giving the kids, right?
That's
That
what's
was that's like, you know what that's like? That's like, say your job is to go check on some kids, and and uh, and you go and you look and you find out one kid is okay, and then you come back, and then something happens to him, and you're like, well, didn't you check on the kids? It's like, well, I went in there. You had one job to do, and you didn't do it. So that's just insane. Why would France? So that's what I'm gonna diss on Francis for not being a great father, and that's about it. Other than that,
yeah,
he's pretty
and
cool.
and the other, so the two kids, yeah, so
They Their
Francis's
early years were
mother,
spent in prison.
Francis's mother finally got the two kids home too, by the way. So
Right,
they did get up home, but apparently they forgot how to speak French. So
right.
they were gone for a while, right?
That's got to be
And
traumatic.
be pretty, probably just didn't want to speak French anymore after having been abandoned by your father.
But anyway,
So
his
yeah,
mom saved the day.
so yeah, and so she should have been king. The mother should have been king, or his wife or sister should have been king, but the French didn't allow women to become kings. Right? England did, Spain did, yeah, but not France. And the kings were gone before they ever got that evolved, right? But
There's one story that is related to this time period, and it was a story in the Shard Lake novels, a scene by Sansom. And I looked it up later, and it really happened. So in the second main war between France and England, and Henry VIII by this time was already all fat and
abused.
gouted, full of gout, but he did travel. He's like, he didn't really participate in the war, but he traveled to the South to watch his Navy fight against
Yeah, the French,
the French
yeah.
Navy. And at that time, um, uh, Henry VIII of England had put a lot of money into the Navy, and he had built this huge boat. It had double rows of cannons, and it was just this giant warship. And he had it all full of people, and they were ready to fight. And they had soldiers with arrows, with nets on top of them. So anyway, that damn boat, and Henry VIII is watching it, and it's called the Mary Rose, and it pivots to turn out to sea to face the
His
French,
son.
and it sinks because it was overloaded, and this sinks right in pretty much the harbor of where the Thames River goes into the English Channel, and it sinks, and all these people die, and Henry VIII is watching it, and the French must be going, "You guys are just dumb," you know. And all these battles, um, it wasn't total war. You can say what you want about how brutal and how brutal they were, but it wasn't total war. Like if you lost a battle, um, nothing's gonna change really because Paris was too far away. There's not like gonna take over Paris. Henry VIII was never threatened Paris, and Francis the First in their wars never really threatened London that much. It was interesting how they could put together these battles and nothing was going to change. Not like in the Bronze Age when civilizations went to battle, they had one battle. That was it. It was all or nothing, right? Um, this was like sport, but people died. I can't help thinking it wasn't total war.
No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't anywhere near total war. And like I said, it was war to Francis and Henry VIII was like tennis, right? We're going to get up and play tennis, or we're going to get up and go to war, right? Matter of fact, tennis was pretty dangerous too. His son died playing tennis.
Yeah, you
His
know
son,
what? They always say that people, like somebody died, like they said he died having sex, because that was the story. But he just died because he was freaking not
or his
healthy.
poison,
But they
or his,
but they did love their sports. Can we talk about going back a little bit more when they are very young and they do all meet at the field of cloth of gold, and Henry VIII Charles V and Francis I are all in their early 20s, and they meet, and they have like weeks of this whole charade where they promise each other everlasting peace. And we talked a little bit about it, how the wrestling match and Francis won. But you know what we didn't mention is that earlier they were having a jousting competition, and Henry VIII actually killed the other jouster on accident.
Yeah, it was a dangerous sport. More dangerous than tennis.
Yeah. Could you imagine that as a sport?
If they died playing tennis. Yeah, as a matter of fact, the king before Francis died in a jousting match. So it's like they gotta cool. They gotta calm down their jousting a little bit. That's a danger. You could lose an eye. Well, Henry VIII almost did lose an eye, right? You got
I would love to have these. I would love to have these guys in the modern era. Could you imagine Francis obviously because he was so tall, he'd be a great basketball player. But could you imagine him on hockey skates
or a pitcher, right?
Or a pitcher?
Pitcher, yeah, he could. You'd be modern royalty, right? He wouldn't have to roll or anything.
I think that the field of cloth of gold, it was in France, so France was the one pretty much hosted it, and Henry VIII was a star. He was running around, but Charles V, my sense of it is that he was like probably a foot shorter than both of them, and he's kind of funny looking with the jaw. And I don't think he was enjoying himself as much as the other two. He was there and they were all conspiring against each other.
Yeah.
At the same time, they were vowing eternal peace.
Yeah, at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, Francis was having an affair with Anne Boleyn, while Anne Boleyn or
Anne Boleyn. Her Anne Boleyn's sister.
Yeah, Anne Boleyn's sister. So they were
those little hotties got around. I tell you what.
And that's where Henry met Anne Boleyn. The Field of the Cloth of Gold when it was hanging out Francis with Anne Boleyn's sister. So
then they had their
kids. A great time. I mean, wouldn't you love to be there?
I would have loved to have been there. Absolutely. And the kids got engaged too. I don't remember, but the kids that got engaged at that, they were like children, and then it didn't happen.
Yeah, they engaged these two little kids.
Yeah.
Right at Pavia to unite the families. Right. And right after that, Henry tried to start up the 100-Year War again, and Charles ended up going with Francis to something. But so one of the first, the Italian wars, one of the first battles were actually Francis won. He was a young man, and he actually won Milan. Right?
Milan, nice.
Milan. He actually had a battle against the Pope, Pope Leo, and Pope Leo X actually was at the battle on horseback at the front of his troops.
The Pope was?
The Pope was.
Holy shit. Nowadays, the Pope rides in a Pope mobile.
People forget, nowadays, they think the Pope was someone. Pope is an old fart who hangs out in the Vatican and never gets out very much. But the popes, there was actually papal land, right, which was like maybe a little less than a third of Italy was actually owned by the papacy. And he had his own troops, his own army, and he collected his own taxes. And when Francis came down to take Milan, Pope Leo goes, bullshit. I'm the Pope, and you do what I say. And if you don't, I'm going to ride on a horse and beat the shit out of you. But he lost. The Pope lost, and he ended up getting Milan. But then after that, it was the Renaissance popes. So
let's talk about when, because Leonardo da Vinci.
No. It wasn't Pope Leo. It was Julius II.
Oh yeah.
He was called the warrior pope because it was always like getting on his horse with his sword and going out fighting anybody. He just loved to fight. And that was Julius. And his name was Julius, not after some historic saint. He
After
named
Julius
himself
Caesar.
Julius because of Julius Caesar.
That dude was in the wrong era. He was like early. He should have been early Middle Ages instead of the 16th century.
Yeah, yeah.
But talk about. Can you tell me about how Leonardo da Vinci? I heard that Leonardo da Vinci came to visit Francis and brought the Mona Lisa
Yeah, yeah.
for him
So
to.
so
Can you imagine
the
that pin? I've seen that picture in real life. It ain't that great. No, actually, it is.
it's small.
It's
It's a
been
lot
traveled
smaller.
around a lot.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's easy to track. It's easy to take, I guess. But
yeah.
that was cool because Francis the First was really into. He was like the Medici kind of guy, but he wasn't. He said he took Florence, not. You said he took Milan, not
Milan.
Florence.
He didn't take Florence. No, but
Because nobody
Milan
took
was.
Florence.
No. Florence is associated with Michelangelo. Michelangelo. Milan is associated with Da Vinci, right?
Hmm.
So Da Vinci actually went up to live with Francis in the end, and helped design some of his chateaus. And Francis actually started the Louvre Museum. So
Yeah.
he said, hey, Da Vinci, I'm starting this art museum. You want to contribute something? and so and so actually the Mona Lisa was one of the first contributions to the Louvre Museum. So there you go. I
Oh,
mean,
so he didn't. So Da Vinci didn't take it, the Mona Lisa back. He left
no,
it.
he left it in for the Louvre.
Wow. You know
Yeah.
what? He should have sent Francis a bill for that, right? Because I'd be like, you owe
Yeah.
me 200,000
Yeah.
ducats.
Yeah, so if you go to the Louvre, you can imagine this big building, and like in 1523, there was only one picture. That was the Mona Lisa just sitting in that one wall, and then they started adding stuff as they went along.
That's a great building because it remains the same except for that glass pyramid up in front. Gives it this space goddess
and Francis had nothing to do with that.
effect. Francis is all, in the future they should build a glass pyramid right
I
here.
mean, right here.
Go,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
interests go down. That's what's
yeah.
weird is when you walk into the Louvre, the first thing you do is you go down like 6 floors.
Yeah,
Well, what the hell?
sure.
Anyway, I'm
So
kind of.
that's quite the contribution. Oh, and also Francis I made French the legal language of Italy and not Latin. This was the time he finally figured out that Latin, nobody spoke it anymore. And so they made French the official language, and he made the first library of France, public library. And every book that was printed in France, a copy had to go to the library.
Yeah, it's like exactly the that's what we do today with the Library of Congress, right?
Yeah,
Every book.
exactly.
He
Exactly.
started
So
that.
yeah, yeah. And I think the other thing we have to note is that all three of these young men, right, didn't, they started by, they were the inheritors, right? Charles V was inheriting Ferdinand and Isabella's Spain, right? They conquered it, they got it set up, they were getting the money from the gold from the New World, and, then Carlos comes along and spins it all. Henry VIII, it was Henry VII who got, ended the War of the Roses and Bosworth Field and saved all the money and gave him a full treasury. And Henry VIII spent it, on wars, for within 10 years. Same with Francis. I mean, his great grandfather was called the Spider because he had webs everywhere and collected money and started the infrastructure and put the nobility down. So all Francis, Henry, and Charles all started with this great inheritance, and so they started young with money, and they go, "What are we going to do with it?" And I think Charles created the Inquisition, right? Henry went through his wife's and created the Anglican Church, and Francis created the Renaissance. So I think of the three, Francis comes out the best. And he came up with French toast, right? In the Battle of Pavia, when he was captured and Pedro found him,
Right.
that they didn't have any food, right? So they had some stale bread and some eggs, and they threw it together, and they
Yeah.
made it sort of. They called it a stew, but basically it was stale bread with egg yolk on it, and it later turned into. So if nothing else, right? He made the great breakfast food.
Yeah, he's right up there with Aunt Jemima, I'll tell you what.
Jemima.
Yeah, and you know what? The architecture and the art that is Paris today is something that is a not just a national treasure for France, um, but it's like a treasure for the world. Even the Nazis didn't well, France surrendered. One of the reasons why they surrendered so quick is that so the Paris wouldn't get blasted. It's that important. If you haven't been to Paris, you should go, because just walking down the river Seine and looking at the buildings and um, the architecture, these people, it was every bit as much of the Renaissance as Florence was, I think. Well,
Yeah,
actually, I've never been to
yeah,
Florence,
yeah,
so I
yeah.
don't
And
know.
I think
But
the other
France,
thing,
the
yeah,
Arc de Triomphe and the Champs Elysees, all that stuff, it's from that time. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So some of the wider streets were produced during the Napoleonic eras, but yeah, the Paris as we know it today was because of Francis. He did turn France around and start the Renaissance, right? And he was the first one to really use diplomatic international diplomacy for his purposes, right? He's the one who set up diplomatic relationships with the Ottoman Turks and the Moroccans, right, who were also Muslim. And he had diplomatic relations with the Protestants in Germany, mainly because it pissed off Charles, yeah, but he still did it, right?
Yeah.
And he was initially very tolerant of Protestantism in Europe, mainly because it was bothering Charles, right? But and he cracked down on it after it actually Calvin showed up in France. He goes, well, that's enough, you know. Yeah, Protestants in Germany, I'm all for, right? Protestants in France, not so much.
You know what's
So
funny is that when Charles V was so pissed off when Francis I reneged that they started their own little Twitter war back and forth, and it got real ugly, and they challenged each other to a duel, right? They were gonna they had picked their first and all that, and they had a time, and they were going back and forth negotiating it, and the rest of Europe was going, come on, guys. That's when the Prince of Transylvania said, when leaders go mad, their people suffer. Because Francis I and Charles V were at each other's throat, and they had planned to have a duel. And who knows who would have won, because a duel wasn't like, oh, well, yeah, Francis would have won. If it was like swords or something, Charles would have just got his head cut off.
yeah, Francis was still young back then. The other thing you got to mention about the Battle of Pavia, that was the first battle where they actually used rifles.
Yeah.
And like, so Francis had rifles or something. They go, well, that's cheating. You can't be using rifles.
Yeah.
That's not chivalry. So it was like the last battle. Oh no, it was Charles. Oh yeah, so Charles had actually hired the Lutherans to fight Francis, right? And then the Lutherans came over with their arquebuses or something and were shooting
Yeah.
the French
And they
knights
started
off
to
their
get,
horses, right?
after
And so
that
the knight,
war, it changed everything, because now you had to have that. Prior to that, they had it too, but they were so bad. It was like most of the time the person firing the weapon was going to be the one hurt. Right? You know what I mean? It took them a long time to get to the point where like more than half actually shoot instead of blow up. And it was so crazy the way they would have it, the first ones, because it would take three people, because you'd have the guy with the gunpowder, the guy with the fire, and the guy with the gun. you know, and it's like, okay, 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 and then blam, and then you all go up. You killed 3 people without firing a shot. But yeah, so they finally got that going. I would love to do
Got that
one just
going.
on military technology, and we could laugh at how silly it was because, wow, it was
Yeah,
just
yeah, because Francis had all these guys with pikes. They were actually called pikemen, right? They
pikemen.
weren't even on horses. They just had pikes. They were carrying
Yeah,
pikes around. And Charles, so the Lutherans are going, "You're kidding me? Are you coming to a gun battle with pikes?"
yeah,
And so it was just shooting down the pikemen. So it was sort of a one-sided battle, and that was like the end of the age of chivalry, right?
yeah,
That
it
was
was.
that's
But you
where
know what?
chivalry.
That it was a great ending because it was total chivalry when at the very last of it, everybody was dead, and Francis the First was still whacking people, and they finally
Yeah, yeah.
surround him,
After
and
they
then
had
they
to
were gonna,
kill the horse from under him, and then he was still fighting.
yeah, they killed the horse from under him, and he was still fighting, and this Pedro de Valdiva, I'm gonna say his name again, because Pedro de Valdiva, the
Yeah,
conqueror of Chile, saved Francis the First, and that was an act of chivalry that should go down
chivalry.
in the
Yeah,
historical. Because if
and
it wasn't for him, he would have been killed,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
everything would have sucked after that.
yeah. If you there's uh, there's an authoress who actually lives in San Francisco now. Her name is Isabel Allende, and she has a novel called Inés de mi Alma, which takes takes Diego's life all the way to the conquering of Chile. If you want to read it, totally, mostly from the female side,
Yeah,
because that was his love of his life in this. But it's a good novel. You should read it. I'll plug it here.
and Chile is a cool place today.
Yeah,
I'd like to go to Chile, Santiago.
yeah.
All right. Well, you know what? We didn't have much to say about Francis the First because there's just not as much information as there is on the other characters, but we managed to talk for 48 minutes.
Wow, we
Or
better stop.
yeah, not quite 40. Oh, that's when we were supposed to start. But anyway, so um I know that we promised we were going to do um continue our 16th century discussions and maybe do one on the popes and maybe do one on Suleiman. I'm not sure what one we're going to do next. Who knows? Let's surprise our fan um,
Yeah,
and um, and keep it a surprise. Maybe we'll do something with the. We'll go way back in time, talk about the collapse of the Bronze Age or something like that. That's a great
yeah,
time.
yeah. Maybe it's still here. Yeah, it's yeah, I mean, the popes would be good because the popes during that time were just the most
Over the
amazing
top.
characters. You know, they had Julius going to war and Leo and the Borgia. I mean, and Cesare. I mean, they were out of control, man. They were just they were out of control, and I mean, and because of that, I mean, they were fun, but man, because of them, we got Luther. We should do one on Luther. If
Yeah,
I would do Luther next, to just I know we talked about Luther before, but we should do just one on Luther, and you know, because he's in that same thing, right? Francis loved Luther as long as Luther was screwing with Charles. As soon as Calvin showed up.
yeah. It is weird if you think about
And,
it
and,
because
and,
if you
and,
put,
and, and Luther is an over-the-top personality,
sure
right?
he
I
is,
mean,
and so are the popes, and it's interesting that Luther gets to be in the same um realm as those other 3 guys. In fact, you could argue that he is more well known than any of those 3. Well, maybe not Henry VIII, but um and
yeah, for
and
sure. I mean,
Luther
you
came
know,
from nothing.
Lutheranism, for God's sake.
Luther was a a second-rate preacher to start with. He came from humble beginnings, let's just say.
Yeah,
Luther
it's
came
more
from
like
more humble beginnings.
it's more like Joan of Arc, right? It's more of a Joan of Arc
He's
type
more of
figure.
a Joan of Arc for sure. And the popes, we could do multiple
He just
popes.
wasn't as good looking.
We could
He was an ugly.
No, he wasn't. Although he liked to drink and party, so I bet you he had a lot of action going on. But I think that the popes during that time frame would be great. And they went through so many, we could do like 3 or 4 or 5 popes in a half an hour because they were just like in and out. All right. So we thank everybody for listening, and tune in next week. And we appreciate great courses. www.patreon.com/Witta. We're going to have some more original music at some point here. But we thank everybody for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next week. If I can find the stop recording button, that'd be great.